Well, praise the Lord. We are in the final session of the A to Z class, Abraham to Zion. And just to remind us again, the scope or the intent of this class is really to focus in on the immutability of God's promise, the unchangeableness of God's promises. God's promise. God promised to Abraham that he would make of him a great nation, and he did. He did exactly what he said he would do. The promise had to go beyond the life of Abraham, had to extend to his children, to his offspring, had to pass through all kinds of seasons and ups and downs and ins and outs and curves and even apostasies in the nation. But then ultimately, God fulfilled everything that he spoke to Abraham, at least up to that point. There's more yet to come. But it's the immutability of God's promises. And I think that the impetus for this course is I think that in the trial, in the duration of the trial, many of God's people, and I say the word advisedly, many of God's people lose confidence in the promise of God because they don't see something tangible and they doubt it. The veracity of what God has said. But we're laying out this map to demonstrate that God is as good as His Word. Now, I am not, neither are you, I'm afraid to tell you, are not as important as Father Abraham. Abraham was a very unique man. But does that make God's promises any less immutable to us? Is God not a man of His Word and a being of His Word? He is dependable, He's faithful, He's true, and He doesn't say it if He doesn't mean it. You know, so many times you talk to people and they say, well, what you said was this. Well, I didn't really mean it. I didn't really mean it. Well, that's not a flaw that God has in His character. And I want this course to encourage His people to see it through. See the promise through. Don't be diverted. Last week we talked about 4 people groups that were diverted from at least the fulfilling the fullness of God's promise. But we need to be like our spiritual father Abraham, who couldn't be moved. He staggered not at the promise of God. And even, to his very dying day, he had expectation that God would fulfill His Word. And one of the things that I've been saying repeatedly through this course is, I'm not going to stand before Him and have to confess to Him I didn't wait. I'm not going to do that. I'm holding on with both arms as tight as I can. Now, I may not see the fulfillment of everything God has promised in this life. Neither did Abraham. I remember one time the Lord impressed upon me, and when I was complaining that a certain thing He spoke to me hadn't come to pass. And you know what the Holy Ghost spoke to me? He said, you don't even know if that's for this dispensation. Don't hold God's feet to the fire. We don't have the right to do that. You hear what He says, you embrace what He says, you enthusiastically commit to what He says, and you don't change because the times have changed. It doesn't work like that. The point that I'm trying to make through the study is times changed. From the time God gave the promise to Abraham, incredibly good and bad things happened, but none of it precluded God from fulfilling His Word. None of it. The sojourn into Egypt, the bondage in Egypt, the wilderness, the failure of the first generation, the 350 years of apostasy during the time of the judges, none of that was able to impede what God said He was going to do. And so tonight I want to get into the message here tonight. I broke tonight's message into 2 sections. The first section is historical, and the second section is futuristic. Because we're going to talk about how it was fulfilled historically in the establishment of Jerusalem, and more particularly the creation of Solomon's temple, which was, without question, the zenith of Israel's history. They were glorified in front of the entire world when Solomon's temple was built. And so the first part, historical. During the time of the judges is where we left off last week. During the time of the judges, it would have appeared as though God had completely forsaken His promise to Abraham. It would have appeared as though it had been completely forsaken. It was I always found it difficult. I don't know if you have as well, but I always found it difficult to read through the book of Judges because practically nothing in there I agree with. I mean, it's all confusion and mishmash, and I mean, you see victories and you see triumphs, and of course that we agree with. But the apostasy, the things that people embraced during that time, you would have thought God had completely forsaken his promise to Abraham. In 1 Samuel chapter 3, verse 1, we read, Samuel, of course, was at the conclusion of the time of the judges. He emerged to be probably one of the most significant, not the most, but one of the most significant men in the whole of the Word of God, if not only just for the fact that he came from a period of 350 years of great darkness, where there was no vision and there was no light, and every man did that which was right in their own eyes. Then Samuel emerges, but it tells us in 1 Samuel chapter 3, verse 1, the condition that existed at the time of Samuel. And the child Samuel ministered unto the Lord before Eli, and the word of the Lord was precious in those days. There was absolutely no open vision. Now, I preached a message several years ago to the youth at Zion that is listed on YouTube, and it really goes into how that Samuel had to hear the word of the Lord and had to hear the voice of the Lord. In fact, that's the name of the message, is the voice, hearing the voice of God. And Samuel really didn't have great examples around him of this happening, and yet this is the beauty of Samuel. I look at Samuel as this, the period of Samuel, the man Samuel, the ministry of Samuel, as light shining in great darkness. Does that sound familiar? A time of great darkness. In a time of great darkness, a light arose, a light shone. We have the unfaithful priesthood of Eli. It was actually of the wrong line anyway, but and eventually they were put away. But there's no light. There's no open vision when Samuel emerged. Now, I'm emphasizing that because even though the vision died, even though there was great darkness, God did not forget his promise to Abraham. And when in the process of time, it was time for God to fulfill that word or to bring them closer in the next step on the journey, we have the emergence of Samuel. And so during the time of the judges at their best, their worship was mixture and idolatry. And at the worst, it was downright heathenistic. And as we said, everyone was doing what was right in their own eyes. And everyone would have concluded at that time that God had forsaken the earth and that God had forsaken his people. And you know, God takes people through this period. God takes churches through this period. God takes fellowships through this period where you think to yourself, well, and I've actually sat down with people and they've said this to me, well, we know what God spoke in the past, but we don't see any of it now. Well, that would have been the time of the judges. But look what happens in the emergence of Samuel. And so when Samuel came on the scene, it seemed as though the light had completely gone out. And yet, you know, Samuel is touted as one of the three most righteous men in the whole of the Word of God. He came from a time of barrenness and darkness. Can God do a thing? God can do a thing. And so in 1 Samuel chapter 3, and I mentioned this in that message I taught concerning hearing God's voice. You know, Samuel wasn't born with this knowledge of how to hear from God. In fact, the first time God calls to Samuel, he doesn't even know it's God. He goes up and he shakes Eli and he says, here I am, my Lord, surely you called me. And he said, get away from me, kid, you bother me. He didn't want to talk to him. And then it wasn't until the third time, and this is how dim-witted Eli was, it wasn't until the third time that he said, I wonder if God's speaking to him. So he sent him out. But when Samuel went back to his bed as a young man, when he went back to bed, a servant of this priest, and he went back to bed, the thing that God spoke to Samuel in that moment of time was going to be the threshold and introduced an entirely new dispensation. It was going to be the time of the monarchy, and Samuel was going to introduce it. And from the monarchy would emerge David and Solomon that would eventually cause the entire nation of Israel to be known throughout the whole world. And God fulfilling his promise. His promise to Abraham, by the way, one of them was that the whole world would be blessed through Abraham. The whole world would be blessed through Abraham. And so with one sentence from the Lord to a man, God brought back the light. God brought back the light and introduced a whole new dispensation. And so Samuel brought into existence under his ministry and under the plan and purposes of God the monarchy in Israel. Now granted, we had to endure the 40 years of the very bad King Saul. And Jeff, if you want to bring up that map up here, we're just going to bring it up here and you can just kind of leave it up there for a little while. But Samuel would eventually anoint King David, and he would anoint him to be king in Israel. He was going to take the place of Saul, who was himself an apostate king who really didn't love the Lord at all. But it was eventually under King David, that Canaan in its entirety was conquered and Jerusalem was made the capital city under David. And this was the promise that God had given to Abraham. And so, obviously we have here, this is actually the palace of David here, and this is the city of David, which is actually, the city of David itself is referred to as Zion. Zion, the city of David. And then, this is Mount Moriah. Now, this is Jerusalem during the time of David. It's much larger than that now, of course. This whole area right now this is actually the area where Solomon's temple would be built. That's the threshing floor right there. And that is proposed to be the very place that Abraham attempted to sacrifice Isaac. And we see the whole journey coming full circle. That's why I entitled this message From Abraham to Zion. It started from Abraham, and it ended in the city of David, Mount Moriah, and Solomon's temple. David and Solomon glorified God throughout the entire world. In 2 Samuel chapter 5, verses 4 through 7, David was 30 years old when he began to reign, and he reigned 40 years. In Hebron he reigned over Judah 7 years and 6 months, and in Jerusalem he reigned 33 years over all Israel and Judah. And the king and his men went to Jerusalem unto the Jebusites, the inhabitants of the land, which spake unto David, saying, Except thou take away the blind and the lame, thou shalt not come in hither. Thinking David cannot come in hither. Nevertheless, David took the stronghold of Zion, the same is the city of David. And so here is the last holdout, the Jebusites in Jerusalem. They have absolutely no idea what they're up against. And I'm not talking about David. They have absolutely no idea. I could almost laugh giddily over this whole thing. They think they're going to prevent David, and yet David is sent from God to help fulfill the promise that he gave to Abraham. They have no idea what they're up against here. The enemy has no idea what he's up against. If you have a promise on your life from God, let me just lay it right on the line. You guys know this already, so I'll be just saying what you already know. Let me just lay it out all out on the line. If you've got a promise from God, the only thing that could prevent that promise from being fulfilled is you. That's it. If you lose heart, if you give up the faith, if you begin to stagger, begin to doubt, begin to take other courses, begin to go in other directions, it's the only thing. The Jebusites cannot stand against the promise. And so, there is a time for us to stand bold-faced in our prayer closet and simply say, I'm not turning away from this. And the fact of the matter is this, the enemies don't voluntarily give up. And so there usually is a heated fight that's involved. But we just can't lose confidence in the word of the Lord. It's a fault. It's a failing if we lose confidence in the word of the Lord. Trials, I was talking to somebody recently, and they said, I'm tired of the wilderness and the cross message. I'm tired of it. Well, so am I. Okay? I don't really embrace that message. I'm far more interested in the resurrection side. But that's not really the point, because that's the journey. That's part of the journey. That's part of the journey. But the enemy said to David, "You shall not come into the city." And David went ahead and he took it. And then, we have Solomon coming thereafter to David. We know it was in David's heart to build a house to the Lord, and he did preserve the ark under a tent. And pastors wrote a very eloquent book on the Tabernacle of David. But all the world eventually came to see the splendor of Solomon's temple. And when people came and they saw Solomon's temple, the half has not even been told of the splendor of this man, of the splendor of your God, because of Solomon's temple. God literally blessed the entire world through Solomon's temple. I have such admiration. I mean, Solomon himself, I've written commentaries on all of Solomon's writings, and Solomon as a figure is not necessarily the man I'm going to pattern my life after. But the one honor, the one distinction that Solomon did have, which actually proceeded from his father, was an honor that God gave actually to his father, that Solomon was able to fulfill because he was the son of David, not because he was just Solomon, because he was the son of David, was that he was able to show the glory of God to the entire world. That was the fulfillment of what God spoke to Abraham. Through thy seed I will bless the world. And we're going to jump to the future here, and that's the blessing that's come upon the church, because we're the children of Abraham as well. God wants to glorify his name in the world. Now, we have a local component to the church, right? A local ministry, and we have an international ministry. God wants to glorify his name in the world. That's a fulfillment of the promise that's been given to Abraham. And so this very place here, where Abraham sacrificed Isaac, and also where David saw the angel of the Lord was standing on the threshing floor of Ornan. In fact, that's why David bought that land. It was because David, when he had actually sinned and numbered Israel, he saw the fearfulness of the angel that stood upon that hill. And that was the place, where worship went up to the Lord. But while I appreciate, the life of David and have much more respect for David than I do for Solomon, I have to say that Solomon's temple was the glory of Israel. It was the magnification of the nation to the world. And in 1 Kings chapter 8 and verse 1, now again, as I mentioned already, it was an honor that was given to Solomon, but the promise was given actually to David. David, you shall not build me a house for thus and thus reasons, but I will give it to your son to build it. And then Solomon himself says, I built this house in David my father's stead. And so, I'm really nervous here because the man wrote the book on David's Tabernacle here, but I will conjecture. I will conjecture here. I'll make my own conjectures here. That I have, I believe, and we're going to read a couple of verses here. I believe that the restoration of the Tabernacle of David, yes, but I also believe in the glory of the restoration of the Solomon temple. Can I at least go that far? Can you agree with me on that?
It's a type of the church.
It is, yeah, it is. So, and I envy not so much the tent of David. I envy the priests falling down and unable to minister in Solomon's temple. I don't crave to be like Solomon. I crave to be like David. But I want the glory that was in Solomon's temple. That's the glory that I crave. Let me just read a couple of verses here. In 1 Kings chapter 8 and verse 1, you understand we are bobbing and weaving through multitude of verses here just to give the consistency of the message here. But there's so much that's left out, and I would like to keep my time. And then 1 Kings chapter 8 and verse 1, Then Solomon assembled the elders of Israel and all the heads of the tribes, the chief of the fathers of the children of Israel, unto King Solomon in Jerusalem, that they might bring up the ark of the covenant of the Lord out of the city of David, which is Zion, and put it into Solomon's temple, where they removed the staves. This is my rest forever. So, the glory goes from the tabernacle of David to the temple of Solomon. And so what I'm looking for a restoration of in the last days is all of the beauty of David's tabernacle, but all of the glory of Solomon's temple. All the glory of Solomon's temple. And I think I can make a case for that. And again, it's conjecture, but I think I can make a case for that out of Acts and Amos as well. But I want to read, I don't want to just keep referring to it. I want to read in 1 Kings chapter 8, verses 5 to 11, concerning the glory that fell. And in verse 5, I'll read from verse 5 to verse 11. Just bear with me as I read this text. And King Solomon and all the congregation of Israel that were assembled unto him were with him before the ark, sacrificing sheep and oxen that could not be told nor numbered for multitude. And the priests brought in the ark of the covenant of the Lord unto his place, into the oracle of the house, to the most holy place, even under the wings of the cherubims. What a sight that must have been. For the cherubims spread forth their two wings over the place of the ark, and the cherubims covered the ark, and the staves thereof above. And they drew out the staves, that the end of the staves were seen out in the holy place before the oracle, and they were not seen without. And they were, and there they are unto this day. There was nothing in the ark save the two tables of stone which Moses put there at Horeb, when the Lord made a covenant with the children of Israel when they came out of the land of Egypt. And then we come to verse 10. And it came to pass, when the priests were come out of the holy place, that the cloud filled the house of the Lord, so that the priests could not stand to minister because of the cloud, for the glory of the Lord had filled the house of the Lord. This was going to be unique. Solomon's temple was going to be unique. And even Solomon's palaces as well were all fairly unique. We won't go down that road, but there's a truth associated there as well. And so God fulfilled what he'd spoke to Abraham on the very spot that Abraham sacrificed Isaac. On the very spot. Now, is that serendipity? Is that happenstance? Is that circumstantial? That all of this time elapsed and God fulfilled his word to Abraham. The important part of this study is this. God fulfilled his word to Abraham, but there was a lot of history in between what God said to Abraham and the fulfilling of this word. There was a lot of history. You know, the years in Egypt in bondage, the wandering in the wilderness, the disqualifications, the spreading out, or the infiltrating of the other nations and apostasy during the time of the judges, the emergence of Samuel, the bright light in the midst of great darkness, and then the establishment of the monarchy. All of this, God fulfilling his word that he spoke to Abraham. So, we have great and precious promises. We have things that God has spoken to us. We can't lose heart on those things. We can't lose heart. We can't lose the confidence that God has made a promise. Now, we have to move into the secondary part of this message, because the promise that was given to Abraham was that his seed would be as the sand of the sea, but also that his seed would be as the stars of the heavens. And we have come to understand and come to translate that as a natural inheritance, as the sand of the sea, it's earthbound, and then the spiritual inheritance as the stars of the heavens, which is the church. And so Paul waxes eloquent in several books, Romans and Galatians, so forth, about, we are the children of Abraham. We are heirs according to the promise of Abraham. We are fulfillment. We are a fulfillment of the promise that God made to Abraham. Do you see the immutability of God's promises? He promised to bless his natural seed, and we see that in the fulfillment of Solomon's temple, the grand years in Israel's history, and we see it all in the church age as well. And yet we are yet to see the glory in the church age. I mean, there have been smatterings of revivals in modern times, but we've yet to see the great glory here. So there's a part 2 here. The New Testament church itself is indebted to Abraham. Galatians chapter 3, verse 16. Now to Abraham and his seed were the promises made. He saith not, and to seeds, as if many, but as of one, and to thy seed, which is Christ. In verse 29, And if ye be Christ's, then are ye Abraham's seed, and heirs according to the promise. We are heirs according to the promise that God made to Abraham thousands of years ago. We're heirs to the promise because the immutability of God's promise. He made a promise to a man, Abraham, and thousands of years later, we're still walking in that promise. That's an extraordinary thing. And yet, because in our tiny little existence, things don't go quite right, and things maybe go against us, we begin to doubt the veracity of God's promises. But we need to hold fast. And so that portion concerning the seed of Abraham in Genesis chapter 22, verses 15 and 18, and the angel of the Lord called unto Abraham out of heaven the second time, and said, By myself have I sworn, saith the Lord. For because thou hast done this thing, and hast not withheld thy son, thine only son, that in blessing I will bless thee, and in multiplying I will multiply thy seed as the stars of the heaven. Right now, in Zion Fellowship, we see departures. We're seeing many departures. And we have, for decades, seen departures. But this promise of multiplicity is one of our promises. It's one of the promises that God has given to us. So forget about the journey. Forget about the ups and downs. Forget about the changing of leaders. Forget about, this, that, and the other, and this trial and the other. Forget about it. It's meaningless, other than the fact that we have to walk it out, and it could take grace. But it's not going to change the promise. Multiplicity is coming. That's the promise. And when I stand before the Lord God himself, I'm going to say, Lord, I'm not ashamed. I waited. Even if I don't see it in my lifetime, I waited. I'm not going to be ashamed to stand before him and say I waited. Now let me tell you something that I know, folks. I know what it's like to stand before him and be ashamed. I know it. I've already experienced it in another area of my life where God wanted some serious changes in my character. It's not pleasant. It's very unpleasant. But let me return back to verse 17. That in blessing I will bless thee, and in multiplying I will multiply thy seed as the stars of heaven, and the sand which is upon the seashore. And thy seed shall possess the gate of his enemies, and in thy seed shall all the nations of the earth be blessed, because thou hast obeyed my voice. We mentioned, I think, last week, the Apostle Paul said this to Agrippa. I was not disobedient to the heavenly vision. You see, the promises of God are conditional. All these things will I do to you, Abraham, because you obeyed my voice. That's the condition. That's the condition. And so we are the spiritual seed of Abraham. Natural Israel is the natural seed. Romans chapter 4, verse 16. Therefore it is of faith that it might be of grace, to the end that the promises might be sure to all the seed, not to that only which is of the law, but to that also which is of the faith of Abraham, who is the father of us all. One of the promises that God gave to Abraham was the promise of multiplicity, multiplying. I will multiply your seed. It's one of the promises that have been given to this church. It's one of the purposes of us being here. And though we look out tonight and we see handfuls of purpose, that's not going to prevent God from fulfilling his word. Fundamentally, you have to ask yourself this question. Did God birth this church or didn't he? And careful how you answer it. Did God birth this church or did he not? If he did, and if God gave us promises, then when you stand before the Lord God, say, Lord, I waited. I may have seen it, I may not have seen it, but I waited, and I believed it, and I held fast. Now, what do you think that God's attitude is going to be towards someone like that? Do you think that perhaps maybe they're going to still inherit what they didn't even see? Yes, they will. They will absolutely inherit what they didn't even see. Will Abraham inherit what he didn't even see? Because he waited. Because he didn't stagger. because he was faithful to the end. Because thou hast done this thing, I will bless thee. We're so earthly in our thinking. We're so carnal in our thinking sometimes. We make major decisions based on circumstances, and they mean practically nothing in the light of eternity. Sometimes less than nothing. If you waited for God to fulfill a promise in your life and you never saw it, you will still inherit in eternity what you never saw. Thus saith the Lord. And so the promise that God gave to Abraham will even extend beyond this dispensation. All the world will be blessed by Jerusalem in the millennium. Now, Jesus Christ obviously is more preeminent than Abraham is. But he's setting up his kingdom on the very spot that Abraham offered Isaac. Geography is going to be a little bit different. We know that from Zechariah 14, but so I don't want to get into all that too much. I mean, right now we have on the right-hand side here, to the right of that, we have the Mount of Olives. That's going to be where Christ touches down. And when he does, that valley right there, the Kidron Valley, which runs north and south, is going to split and run east and west. And so, the geography is going to be quite a bit different. But, and then we have, we can't get into all of that. I want to bring this, I can't say this is my final thought just yet, so I won't. And finally, brethren, the promise, I'm not going to belabor this, but I do have to develop certain things here. In Amos chapter 9, verses 11 and 12, and also in Acts chapter 15, verse 16, it says that God will restore in the last days. He'll restore the Tabernacle of David. And for that, again, I refer you to Pastor Dan Karam's book on the Tabernacle of David. But let me say this here, and this is the reason why I say I think we can include Solomon's temple in this, is because the wording that's used in Amos and the wording that's used in Acts is this. It says, I will raise up the ruins and I will restore the breaches thereof. Well, I don't think taking a tent down can be considered a ruins. And they weren't a ruins because they took the ark from the tent to Solomon's temple. There were no ruins in David's tabernacle. But the promise in Amos and in Acts, the same word is used in both places. It says, I'll restore the breaches and I'll restore the ruins. So I think in the economy of God, and again, this is my conjecture. This is my conjecture based on what I just stated to you. That when we see the discussion concerning the restoration of the Tabernacle of David, we're really talking about the glory of the Temple of Solomon as well as the Tabernacle of David. Because the order that existed in Solomon's temple was first established in the Tabernacle of David. And so there was continuance, you might say. There was expansion. There was one sprang forth from the other. And when Pastor gets up to give his closing comments, he can correct any error that's involved in that. But you don't call a tent that was purposefully dismantled ruins. They weren't ruins. The ruins were Solomon's temple. And by the way, we have a logistic problem here. That's under Muslim control right now. That's a problem. So we're going to see some interesting things take place in our day. The dome of the rock is covering a rock. And tradition holds that rock is the rock that Abraham offered Isaac on. The Jews refer to it actually as they call it the navel of the earth. That's where everything started from. I don't know if that's really true or not, but anyways, that's what they say. We'll leave it as the place where Abraham offered Isaac. And so now we can bring this to a conclusion. We covered, very briefly, of course, in very rapid pace, Abraham, the promises that were given to Abraham that flowed through Isaac, flowed through Jacob, flowed through Joseph, flowed through Moses, flowed through Joshua. Not much can be said about the time of the judges. I mean, there were a couple of good judges there, but then we have the emergence of Samuel, a light that shone in the midst of great darkness, a light arising in the midst of great darkness, the establishment of the monarchy We had to endure the wretched 40 years under King Saul. Then there was David, who took the city of David. Jerusalem dispossessed the Jebusites, established the Tabernacle of David, and then Solomon, his son, built a house that magnified Jehovah throughout the whole world. And the whole world melted at the splendor that existed in the reign of Solomon. All of this because God made a covenant with a man. And then it jumps, of course, to our generation. We are the children of Abraham and heirs according to the promise to Jesus Christ. Jesus Christ humbles himself to say that he's the seed of Abraham. Paul says if you're of Christ, then you also are of the seed of Abraham. The beautiful nature of God's promise. One of the things that frustrated the Lord immensely, more in the journey of the children of Israel, but also in the time of the judges as well, one of the things that frustrated God so much was that it was the faithlessness of his people, that they refused to believe in him. They refused to believe in his word. You know, that's not a burden I'm willing to carry. That's not a burden I'm willing to bear. In our day, people are giving up on the promises of God, and I understand it. I understand the pressures that are coming. I understand the contradictions that exist. I understand the coldness. I understand, the darkness that's all around us. But I also understand that they are absolutely impotent as it relates to interfering with God, what God has promised to his people. And there are many voices out there. And we have to be very careful about the voices that we listen to. We have to ask ourselves, where is this voice coming from? What is the spirit behind this? What are they trying to accomplish? Are they building up the people of God? Or are they tearing them down? Are they bolstering what God has spoken to them? Or are they casting doubt and fear? When I did last week's study, I made a comment. And the comment was this: I would not want to be one of the 10 spies who brought back an evil report and fouled a whole generation and made them miss God. I would not want to stand in their shoes. And there are people that are like lions today doing the same thing. They're doing the exact same thing, and don't you believe them? You hold fast to the promise of God. You hold fast to the things that you've been taught. Hold fast, as Paul says, to the traditions, which Pastor informed me actually could mean teachings. Hold fast to the teachings that you've heard. The message is not obsolete. It's the message that starts way back with Abraham, and it's been good for thousands of years. Hold fast to the promise of God. Let's never be ashamed in eternity. I want to end with Romans chapter. This is really my last verse. It really is. I trust me. Believe me, it is. And we're not even going to elaborate on it. But let's follow in the footsteps of Abraham our father, okay? In Romans chapter 4, verse 20 and 21, it says, he staggered not at the promises of God through unbelief, but was strong in faith, giving glory to God, and being fully persuaded that what he had promised, he was also able to perform. Let me see a show of hands tonight. How many believe? Nobody's not going to raise their hand. Good, that's good. I'll put both mine up as well. You ask questions like that, and nobody would dare not raise their hand. But and that actually one of the reasons why I asked it. But the thing is this here: when you break down the logic and you break down the reasons why people get off the path, and I'm not talking necessarily about, falling into sin or anything like that. I'm talking about people that lose confidence in the promise of God and get off the path. When you break their arguments down, the more you break them down, the more they disappear. Until at the end of it all, you find it's really nothing at all. It really is nothing at all. I talked to an individual recently, and they made a bombastic statement to me. This is a person, I won't go into too much detail here, but they're making a bombastic statement that was what I would qualify as the gospel of doubt. And they made this bombastic statement, and I said, where are you getting that from? Where is that coming from? And they couldn't tell me. And I said, can you give me one example? You're giving this bold declaration here. Can you give me one example? Just one to back up your claim. Well, there must be. Everybody's saying it. There must be. When you really break it down, it's nothing. And the one individual that I was talking to, it boiled down to policies. Well, I don't like the way they do this. I don't like the way they do that. I don't like the way they do the other. Really? Doesn't seem like a great reason to make a big change. Policies? If you've heard from God, you've heard from God. What does policy have to do with it? In the time of Abraham, from the time of David, there were all kinds of policy changes, all kinds of leaders that changed, all kinds of things that happened. Who cares? Don't get wrapped around the axle on policies, folks. That's not where it's at. Anyways, I said I would finish, so I'm done. God bless. Anyways, I hope that something in the last three classes had some meaning to you.